Happy Pride, everybody. My name is Jacob, and welcome back to Sunday Yap Session. I'm here with Gay Mario. As opposed to not Gay Mario. This is usually like off to the side where you can't really see him, but I figured we'd bring him out today and have a little bit of fun. Today I am drinking a ginger beer. I just got these recently from Aldi, and I was like, this is fun. It's good. Tastes like ginger. It's very tasty. If you're new here, my name is Jacob, and this is Sunday Yap Session, where every single Sunday I hop on here and I yap at y'all about something, and hopefully with some sort of cohesive theme. And today's theme is going to be Pride. If you are interested in liking and subscribing to the video, I would greatly appreciate it. We're going to talk about a variety of Pride topics today. Before we get into that, though, I did want to do a little bit of a Pride fit check because I wore my Pride stuff intentionally today. We got some eyeshadow on today. I figured I'd change things up for y'all a little bit. And then I also have this shirt. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Maybe you'll need to insert a picture. This is from Massive Goods. This is one of my favorite shirts ever. It was a queer-owned manga distributor and like fashion company. Unfortunately, they're not in business anymore. And if you are the people that ran Massive Goods, please open Massive Goods back up. I love this shirt. I loved all of the stuff on it. I wish I would have bought more. And I'm a big Gengoro Tagame fan, so it was nice having a place to buy those. Please open back up. Please open back up. It's kind of funny in gay world, especially in like bear spaces and stuff. This shirt is like so coveted. Every time I post a picture with this shirt on, all of my friends are like, oh my gosh, you have that, like I wish I would have bought one. So it's like my little gay flex. And then we got the shorts. I'll stand up, hopefully you can see these. We got some shorts from Lockwood 51. They are a queer owned brand based out of Los Angeles, I believe. I have so many clothes from them. If you see me wearing like 5-inch inseam hoochie daddy shorts, I probably bought it from them. And if you see me wearing like punky anarchy adjacent looking queer clothes, I probably bought it from them. Maybe I'll put in some pictures as well. I'm a big fan of them, and they have been really, really cool. I've interacted with the people that run the brand a couple times, and they've always been super, super kind, super nice. And this is your reminder to support actual small, indie, queer-owned brands this Pride season, as opposed to the corporate overloads that only are catering to us because we give them money. I'm looking at you, Target, specifically. The rainbow capitalism of it all really has gotten out of hand, and I know that we're all playing a part in that. This is a call in, not a call out. I'm not gonna act like I didn't buy stuff from the Target Pride collection last year before they started acting extra crazy and decided that queer people were less important than a few small people in a vocal minority complaining about us existing. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get into that. I guess a good place for us to start today is kind of talking about like what Pride means to me and kind of my feelings about Pride. And then later on, I also want to talk about the Pride discourse, because I'm on TikTok and I feel like every Pride season on TikTok, there is some discourse. It's usually either about like kink at Pride. We'll talk about that. Open relationship and like non-monogamy. We'll talk about that too. Trying to exclude trans people from the community for some ungodly reason. We'll get into that. We'll unpack all of the discourse. But I feel like every single Pride season on social media, and I feel like it's been this way for a while, it ends up being so discoursey and so much like infighting. And there's historical context for that, which we'll get into too. And I was kind of hesitant about even like getting into some of these things because a lot of this does require nuance and a lot of it does require some historical context. But then I remembered we're on YouTube. Y'all love context. Y'all love getting into the deep dives of things. But this is not gonna be like a super cited deep dive. We're keeping it chill, we're keeping it casual today. So when we get to that section of the video, know that it's all going to be based on like reading I've done, and there's facts to back it up. I'll probably put some citations in the caption, but this is not a video essay. We're just chatting, we're just kikiing. But I guess to start, we'll start with kind of like my personal Pride journey and my history with Pride and things like that. I'm excited for Pride this year because I've actually never been to my local Pride before. I've only been to Chicago Pride twice. I'll put some pictures in. Weirdly enough, I don't know why that was the case. I think that actually every single time that local Pride was happening at a time where I was out and proud in public, I was either out of town or I was in Chicago going to Chicago Pride. So shout out to the Chicago Pride people. But I'm super excited to go to Pride this year with my boyfriend. This is his first time actually going to. Every single time he's gone, he's actually just been doing volunteer work and stuff like that, helping the Pride parade run and stuff, but he's never actually gone to the Pride either. So this is gonna be our first one. And I think that's cool that I'm going to Pride like in a relationship, because I've never actually done that before. But I guess like my Pride journey and my queer journey or whatever. So I was gonna say unfortunately, not unfortunately, it is a trope that like I know people have fallen in, and I maybe will unpack this at some point, but I did feel bad about it. But my Pride journey started out I think I came out publicly when I was 18. Yeah, this was back when like Facebook was still relevant. So I had my little Facebook post. I think I actually still have it. So if you If we want to like unpack the cringe of what was probably cringy, I don't remember exactly what I said, but my coming out post, I just stumbled across the Google Doc the other day, so we can get into that. But I came out very publicly, and before that, I came out to my mom in a letter privately before I kind of like went like public about everything. I should ask my mom if she still has that, because that would be interesting to read too. So I remember I was very standoffish, and I remember the tone was very much like, because I come from a religious upbringing and a religious background, and we'll unpack that at some point because I got lots of religious trauma. But I knew that like I didn't have like a fear or anything that like I was gonna get kicked out of my house or anything. I knew that like my family and like the people around were like generally homophobic, but it was not like a violent vitriol. It was more just, we believe the Bible says this, so on and so forth. And so like I wasn't scared I was gonna get kicked out, but I knew my family was not gonna be like excited about this or whatever. So I remember like I wrote my mom a letter, and it basically said, this is what the tea is. And at the time I was identifying as bisexual. I'm bisexual. I don't want to talk about it. There's not going to be any conversation to be had. This will not change. I just wanted to tell you. And I really should ask her if she still has that, because I feel like the tone was probably like so angry and standoffish in a way that was valid and was real at the time, but like maybe was not super necessary. I probably came in a little bit hotter than I needed to on that. But oh well. Our relationship has gotten a lot better than in that sense. My mom has met both of the like long-term partners. I've had my current one and the relationship I was in before. Never been an issue. Super cool, super great. She's come a long way. And I really do appreciate that, because I was definitely like a little homophobe as well when I was a younger kid, just from the information I received in the church, the upbringing of people around me and stuff. So it was indoctrinated in all of us. I'm proud of mom. I don't know if she's like on board now and like fully an ally, but like she supports me and she supports my love. That's good for me. I'm happy with that. So yeah, I came out when I was 18 very publicly. I mean, it was like a courage thing, but like less of courage and more of, I was like pretty solidly at that time sure that at the very least I was attracted to men. Like I said, I came out as bisexual, and I feel like I have to be like delicate about how I talk about this, because I don't think that I wasn't, but I think subconsciously, and if I question that and like challenge it deeply, it was in some ways I think softening the blow of, I'm not gay, there is a chance I could be with a woman. But there were like women that I went to school with and stuff that I was attracted to and I was romantically interested in. So at least for a period of time that was real, but we're getting a little bit too in the weeds about that. So I came out as bisexual. There was a very interesting reaction. About half of the people were like, yeah girl. Like, we know. And then a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea, da 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 da. And if you're watching this, and if you were one of the people that knew I was like bisexual, queer, gay, whatever, we'll get to like when I hit queer, y'all should have told me, because I didn't know until I knew. And there were so many people that were like, yeah, that was like super obvious and we knew and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, I wish one of y'all would have had a conversation with me. That would have saved me so much time figuring out myself. Obviously, that's like a conversation that's kind of difficult to navigate, I guess, just coming up to someone and being like, hey, I think you got something going on. Have you ever like questioned your sexuality or your gender identity? But yeah, so that was that journey. That also led to some very interesting places. A lot of people, and out of the kindness for y'all, I will not drag y'all for filth in this video, but several people who took the time to set me aside and basically question why I was doing this and trying to convince me that it was because I was not going to church enough. Maybe we'll unpack that at some point and we'll get into the real tea of that. Because suffice to say, there were a lot of people that were not happy about me coming out. But I was just like, girl, whatever. I was very happy to do that. Kind of what I was touching on earlier. It was so much less of like a courage thing, because I feel pride and coming out is kind of portrayed as a courageous act, and not that it isn't, but for me it was more just the reality that I knew that I was not straight. I am not interested in living a life that is not real and that is not me, and that's been a continual practice, and that'll come up throughout a lot of these yap sessions as kind of like self-actualization and coming into myself. But at that point, I was an adult, I was 18, I was ready to kind of start a new chapter. And so that's primarily the reason I came out. I was just ready to be honest and in my truth, and so on and so forth. So I was identifying as bisexual for the next several years, and as I got older, my interest in women very quickly was waning. And I find that interesting too in reflection, because there were several opportunities for me to like date women and have experiences with women. I think when I was like younger, I maybe had like 2 school girlfriends, and neither one of them lasted longer than like a week. But when I was getting into like high school and college and things like that, it wasn't that like women weren't interested in me. I just never reciprocated it or anything. And in retrospect, I think the writing was on the wall, but I was true to my belief at my time. And then I didn't realize that I was just like gay until I was 21. And I remember having this conversation with my partner at the time, sitting in his room talking, and I kind of was just like, oh, I think I'm actually just gay. I think that's the piece of the puzzle that was missing. I had a realization about that. Again, Facebook was still relevant, so I think I did another post, like I second coming out. And that's the thing with coming out for people who are not out or people who are not living a LGBTQIA experience. Coming out is, and I thought this when I was younger, I thought that coming out, you just do it once and then everyone knows and then you never have to really address it again. Coming out is like a continual practice. You are constantly coming out and coming out and coming out. But yeah, so I think I made another post that was like, actually, I'm gay. And I felt really bad. And this is kind of what I was mentioning at the beginning. I think that there is a stereotype that people who are gay come out as bisexual to soften the blow and to portray themselves as someone who could still be with a woman. I'm talking specifically about gay men. So there was a part of me that felt bad that I kind of fell into that trope, but also that wouldn't exist if there wasn't the pressure from cis straight society for us to be with women. So like it's not my fault. Not my fault. And like I said, I do feel that me being bisexual was actually true. It wasn't a scapegoat. It was more a lack of me understanding myself fully. So then at that point, I thought I had it figured out. I thought I was just a gay man and I was good to go. And then the pandemic happened and I was at home a lot. I had a lot of time to think. There was not as much going on in the world. And that's when I realized I was non-binary. I can't even remember specifically when that was, but I'm guessing that was 2020, late 2020, early 2021. And the way I figured that out was through Dungeons and Dragons of all things, basically. And apparently this is not a unique experience after I looked this up and looked into it a little bit. But I was playing a Dungeons and Dragons character and I decided to make them non-binary. And as we were playing the campaign and as we were going on, and a lot of this was kind of in retrospect to thinking about it, but I really quickly realized that my character was a self-insert character. And I think I was using Dungeons and Dragons to process my gender identity. So that's when I realized that I was non-binary. Shout out to my Dungeons and Dragons campaign, who we're still playing to this day. Shout out to my friend Sam in particular for getting me into that Dungeons and Dragons campaign. That meant the world to me. Having that social interaction online throughout the pandemic, because this was, not that the pandemic isn't over, still ongoing, but this was when the pandemic started. I believe I started playing Dungeons and Dragons around like late summer 2020. Shout out to that friend group for holding it down and giving me a community and a social interaction to be in, and also helping me figure out my gender identity. If you don't play Dungeons and Dragons, it can do a lot for your life, so get into that. And now that's just the situation I'm in, a queer, non-binary person. I say queer specifically because of the political implications and also because gay feels a little more narrow than my experience. I'm still growing up, I'm still learning. So I'm not exactly sure that I am just strictly attracted to men. Well, actually, I know that that's not true because I've been attracted to non-binary people, so on and so forth. I'm very open-minded. So I use queer because it's very open-ended and just like my gender identity and my attractions are varied. And now here we are. And I'm really grateful in a lot of ways that my coming out experience, my multiple coming out experiences have all been really tame. I know people that have, experienced being kicked out of their home. I know people that have been sent to gay conversion camps. I know people that have had a really, really, really rough time, and I'm so grateful that my experience has been generally smooth. Not to say that I haven't experienced homophobia and discrimination and things like that, because I definitely have, especially like in the workplace and stuff. Not where I work now, but like other places. But I know that it could be a whole lot worse, so I'm really grateful that my coming out experience and my navigating my gender identity and my sexuality has been overall relatively not that bad and not that difficult of a journey. So I think that's pretty much all I had to say on that. So now let's get into the discourse of it all. So like I mentioned earlier, I feel like every Pride season, especially on TikTok, there is always discourse about a handful of little topics that are annoying to say the least. And I feel like a lot of these discourse and a lot of these conversations really reflect a lack of understanding and a lack of historical knowledge about the history of Pride and the history of these communities and all of that. So I kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit. We are going to be talking about sex and sexuality in this part, so if you don't want to hear that, this would probably be the time for you to click off the video. I have been adding chapters to my video too, so if you kind of want to skip ahead this chapter, feel free to do so. But like I mentioned, a lot of these discourses are kind of around similar topics. The two that come to mind the most are talking about kink at Pride and talking about like open relationships and non-monogamy and hookup culture ruining the gay community. And I think this was really interesting, and I was kind of pondering over the last few days how I wanted to tackle this. And I think I want to start with the historical context, because I think that's really interesting. And I think in a lot of ways, the discourse and the conversations that we're having about Pride and coming out and all of that really haven't changed. I actually read this really interesting book called Stonewall. I forget the name of the author, but I'll put it on the screen. I would highly recommend you read it because I think it was really interesting learning about the history of gay pride and the events around Stonewall, because the author at the beginning talks about, and I found this really interesting, and I've definitely seen this, there is a lot of like mythology around Stonewall, and this book does a really good job of like kind of cutting through all of that and more so talking about like what actually happened, and not more importantly, but an important contextually explaining all of the things that kind of led up to that moment, because I think a lot of people think about Stonewall as like this moment in time where this spontaneous thing happened, and while it was spontaneous, there was a lot of context that led up to that point. And because of this kind of mythological thinking when it comes to Stonewall, there's been a lot of narratives that have been painted that are not true. Right now I'm thinking about that clip from Drag Race where, what's that queen's name? The one that's the Britney Spears impersonator that was like, people died at Stonewall, and Willem was like, nobody died.
Like when people don't know what Stonewall is. You know what I mean?
Won't you tell everybody what that is?
That was fighting for gay rights, and people were killed.
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
Nobody was killed?
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
But yeah, so I think it's important to kind of know that context when it comes to talking about these things. And an interesting thing that I saw come up in the book and talking about like all of these kind of like gay social societies and these political organizations is that the girls were fighting all the time, even back then. That was something I found really interesting about the book, because basically, to summarize, and like I said, read the book. It's been a minute since I read it, so like I'm paraphrasing a lot of this information, but there were basically like these little gay socio-political think tank societies, essentially is what I'm going to call them, that were talking about different ways to seek gay liberation, essentially. There was one called like Mattachine or Mattache, I think, a couple other ones as well. And a lot of these people had really different ideas for how to kind of go about queer liberation. And there was a lot of misogyny that took place because women and lesbians and that whole community was a lot of times excluded from these conversations. So when I'm talking a lot about this too, we're talking about primarily gay men in these conversations, because they did not want the women there, and that's a fatal flaw of that movement at the time. But so you had basically, for the most part, these gay men basically bickering and having infighting and discourse across these local chapters, and also these efforts at building national coalitions about how to achieve gay liberation. And there were kind of like two different thought processes that went, or broadly speaking, I'm gonna really simplify this. There was the like radical, more revolutionary standpoint, which is where I find myself in, and the ideology that I align myself with, that says we shouldn't have to change anything about ourselves. We should be able to be who we are, and society needs to accept us and needs to create social structures to accept us and to create equality and to basically accommodate us into the larger society. And then there was another pathway that people were taking that was more like assimilationist, and basically that said like we need to model ourselves after cis straight society, and we need to ingrain ourselves in society, and that's how we'll achieve acceptance. Now, there are pros and cons to both sides, but I have no interest in minimizing myself or making myself more palatable or succumbing to the wills of cis straight society. So like, it's a chop for me. But I think a lot of those ideologies are still here today, and that's why we have a lot of this discourse. And it's discourse that I find annoying, because if you look at the historical context, specifically for the Kink at Pride thing, which I want to kind of get into first, there are very clear answers to these questions. So getting into the kind of Kink at Pride discourse, basically there is discourse both online, and I think this may have started even a little bit before TikTok, but I see it on TikTok all the time, where people are basically saying that like the kink community and people that participate in kink should not be welcome at Pride, should not be able to wear their like gear and their cultural garb to Pride, and that they should not be doing any of that, and that Pride should be a very family-friendly celebration that everybody can attend. And to start, I have a lot of questions for those people. First and foremost, like, have you been to a Pride event, actually? Because the vast majority of the Pride things that I've participated in pretty much have been family-friendly. The most, like, lewd thing that I will usually see is, like, maybe somebody in a pup mask or, like, someone in a thong or something, but, like, it is never really that wild. I feel like a lot of people are acting like Folsom Street Fair is like a representation of every single Pride event, which really like isn't the case. And also, like I said, if you look at the historical context, the kink community is at Pride because the kink community was there from the beginning. If you look at like Stonewall and the events that happened and all that went on there, a lot of the people that were participating in that outside of, you know, the LGBTQ community, which of course there was overlap, but the kink community was largely there too, because in a lot of similar ways that LGBTQ people were seen as freaks and like weird and like people that should not be accepted in society, the kink community was ostracized in very similar ways. So they were very clearly there. There were like a lot of leather daddies and kinksters and so on and so forth that were a part of Stonewall and were a part of the first Pride and were a really big part of advocacy. And also a lot of like leather bars were some of these safe spaces and the very, very few safe spaces that LGBTQ people could participate in. So to try to like divorce that community from Pride and from like the historical context is actually insane to me. And I think it is a really big reflection of the lack of knowledge about our history that we need to be exploring. And like I said too, I feel like people are acting like there are very, very obscene acts being taken place at like your average Pride parade, which isn't the case. And anyone who has been to a Pride parade knows that. Also at this point, because Pride has become so big and so commercialized and so like corporate in a lot of ways, there are so many like family friendly, specifically made to be family friendly Pride events. So if like you really like just don't want to see anything related to kink or obscenity or sexuality or anything, like those exist. It is not hard to find those things, and it is like very disrespectful actually to say that those people do not belong in a celebration that was originally a protest. Mind you, the sanitization of Pride is actually like wild too, but that's a whole other topic and that could be its own video. This was never meant to be like a super family friendly corporate sponsored event. This was political protest. This was a solidarity movement. This was a celebration of being queer and being alive and like being proud of yourself and trying to achieve liberation and equality. And I guess that leads us into the kind of conversation that comes around about open relationships and non-monogamy, like destroying the gay community, which I also think is hilarious and I think really reflects the sex negativity that we're seeing rise in our American culture specifically. I can only speak to an American lens. And I find that extra interesting too, specifically in the context of Pride, because that's when this comes up a lot of the times. Because similarly to the kink community being involved with Pride, a lot of the key figures in like the Stonewall uprising, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, so on and so forth, a lot of people involved in this were sex workers, were sexually promiscuous people, either just because they wanted to or because they had to survive and make a living. And I think it's also widely disrespectful too to suggest that people that are more open with their sexuality and sexual experiences are somehow ruining the community, because the community was built by those people. And I also think that people that are non-monogamous, people that are in poly or open relationships, are like such a small minority, and it is very, very funny that people think that like this small niche community is like somehow destroying the gay community and destroying the dating scene, and that everyone wants an open relationship, because that really just truly is not the case. I am someone who was in an open relationship, and actually I think all of my relationships have been open. I've never really like been in a monogamous relationship because I don't want that, and I'm always very upfront about that. It's never like a secret covert thing. That is the life I am choosing to live, and everyone I've dated, no one's had a problem with it. But it really is such a niche experience. I think that the majority of people are monogamous. The majority of people are not having open relationships. The majority of people are not doing polyamory, and it is such a niche subset of the community that has been blown out of proportion. So to suggest that they're like destroying the gay community is actually insane to me as well. This could be a whole video in and of its own, but I think if anything, the lack of communicating intentions is making the dating scene and making navigating the gay community hard, because there is an ambiguity of what people want. And I think if a lot of people were more clear and more upfront about their intentions, we wouldn't have these issues. But that's a conversation for another day. Oh, and lastly too, I think I briefly touched on earlier, like there's some weird movement from people, and I think like a lot of this is like log cabin Republicans and like weird conservative self-hating gays that are trying to like say that trans people do not belong in this community. Trans people are the community. Trans people are the backbone of the LGBTQIA plus community. That's not even worth like breaking down because it's insane. I know I've seen like some discourse that people say like, well, their experiences are so different and distinct from being just like sexuality based experiences, but like there's so much overlap. They've been here since the beginning. They are pillars of our community. There is no reason that they should be ostracized from the community. That's just like pure insanity. And I think the discourse around these things makes me like extra annoyed, especially today, because there are so many more important things that we need to be focused on, like the systemic legislation that is targeting trans people and trying to basically legislate them out of the public eye, the alarming rates of like LGBTQ youth being homeless, the laws and legislation we're seeing that's targeting like drag queens specifically. There are so many like systemic attacks on the queer community as a whole. That's what we need to be focused on. We need to get back on track, because it's like arguing and infighting, not that it's like new, like I said. It's happened before, it's happening now, and it'll happen again. I think that's just the reality of being in like a space where there are lots of different people from a lot of different experiences and background kind of coexisting and trying to like unite. There's always going to be some level of infighting, and like sometimes the discourse and the internal conversations lead to productive outcome. I'm not saying that like this needs to completely end, but like we need to get back on track and get the focus back on the things that actually matter. We need to be uniting and figuring out how to stop the systemic legislation of us out of the public eye. I think that's way more important, and I think that's going to be much more beneficial to us in the long run. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to yap about today. I feel like we like got a little heated there for a moment. I'm very passionate about this stuff, if you can't tell. But yeah, so happy Pride, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. Let me know below about your Pride experiences or your coming out experiences or things like that. I always love hearing about those things. Like I said earlier, I'm excited to be going to my first like local Pride event, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to seeing that. And I'm going to be masked up because we are still in a pandemic, and I'm always going to bring the pandemic up. One day we will have a COVID episode where I'll really get into this stuff. But if you are attending Pride events, inside, outside, either way, it's going to be a lot of people in a lot of crowded spaces, and I would highly recommend you wearing a proper N95 or KN95 respirator if you have access to those. If you don't, I'll put some resources in the description where you can get free masks. Limiting the transmission of COVID, especially during these big events where there's lots of people around and it's very crowded, is very important. So yeah, thanks for yapping with me. Thanks for talking about Pride and gay discourse with me. I will be back next Sunday, and I hope you will as well. At the end of this, it's going to give you some videos that it thinks you should watch. If you haven't watched the other two Sunday Yap sessions, I would highly recommend giving those a watch. I think they were really interesting. The first one's kind of just an introduction, and the second one was about friendship, and I really enjoyed talking about that. Thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing y'all next time. Happy Pride. Mario, say happy Pride. Say gay rights, Mario. Mario's not, he's not being a very good pillar of our community right now, and I'm so sorry for that.